Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page top of 1371. Good. And we move now, after explaining Mikra, which is rooted in the Chabad of Atzilus. The verses that written Torah, rooted in Chabad, which is really higher than revelation, but it's revelation to oneself, to the divine, and that manifests in Asiyah, simple stories, the basic mitzvahs, without details and explanation. Mishnah is rooted in Chagas of Atzilus, so there's more revealed to relating to existence, and therefore more details in the Mishnah that governs and is associated with the workings of this world, and helping us understand how to live our lives aligned with God. So the Mishnah tells us the halachas, what is kosher, what is mutter, what is tahir, the things that are permitted, Mishnah, the details around the verses, and that manifests in Yetzirah, the Vav Ksavos of Malchus of Yetzirah, Mishnah, also called Issachar, the wife, the spouse of Nar, of Zah, and Shifcha, because it manifests in the physical and in the birurim of clarification and separation of defining what the laws of the Torah are and how we should live our lives, and clarifying the birurim in this world, to clarify and to create the structures of how to live our lives, what is allowed, what is not allowed, etc. So then, the Rebbe Rashab, even though the next stage is Talmud, but there's another category which is something in between, Braisa. As we explained, Braisa is still from the Tanoim, the Baalei Mishnah, the people who wrote and said the Mishnah is the Tanoim. The things they taught outside of the base medrash is called Braisa, like Bar, Yais, Braisa, Abar, the word outside. But it's still in the category of Tanoim. So we began learning that at the bottom of page 1370. But before I continue summarizing, let me just put it all in context. That all this discussion about the different parts of Torah began at the bottom of page 1364, following the three levels that he spoke about in Makabel, the of Malchus, that has no energy, a light of its own, but it receives light. That there are three levels in that: the moon, a bright luminous stone, and the vision, the light of sight. Three different ways of Kabbalah, and that's how we started the difference between Mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud. Going to get back to that in a while, not so fast, but we'll soon get back to that. That will be, just to give you the structure, I already mentioned this, but I'll just say it again. On page 1386. So we're now on 1371, another 15 pages. And he's going to go back and say, after explaining Mishnah, Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, and now also Mishnah, Braisa, Talmud, he's going to come back and explain these three, the association. Now, why was he talking about those three? That was following the discussion of Ner Mitzvah V'Torah Oir. We was talking about Ner, the Neshama is compared to a flame, to a candle, as well as a mitzvah. And that followed, and he explained the three different dimensions in Ner, how we take from the material world and we turn it into divine fire, divine light. And before that, began the whole topic of Torah in general, that Torah is Torah Oir. Not just Ner, but Torah Oir. This was on top of page, I believe, 1350, yeah? That the Torah is Mamayla Lamata. And he asked the question, what's the difference between the neshama of the neshamas and Torah? Both of them are associated with Adam. That was the flow. So bottom line is, all of this is part of the discussion of interface. So when we're learning now about Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, and Braisa, it's really, if you think about it, it's actually bringing together two worlds. The world of God, God's Torah, and our world, the material world. That's what Torah was given to come below, Like he said, Torah is rooted in the highest levels. It's divine. In Atzilus, it's Elikus. But when it comes into Bri, Yetzirah, especially Yetzirah discussed, now it's beginning to manifest and relate to things in this physical world and teaches us, Avedas HaBerurim, how to separate between the kosher and the not kosher, between the permitted and the prohibited, between the pure and the impure, to know what to do, what not to do. So we see Torah has both aspects to it. One is it's expressing God's will and God's wisdom, but it manifests in this world, like he said, but it's a Torah achas. Even when it comes into the level of shivcha, like a maidservant, that's because it's manifesting in the garments of this world. Like he said, preparing food, where there you have to separate between the food, between the waste and the nutrients and so on, berurim. But Torah be'etzem is a godly thing. But you want that godliness to manifest within our existence. So if you think about it, Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud are three ways. Mikra is far more divine, and that's why its expression to us is in simple terms. Mishnah is more bislapshus, not as pure elikus. It's already elikus as it's relating to another chagas, mides, connecting to existence, and therefore more manifest in Gashmis and in Berurim, which Mishnah does. And Talmud will learn afterwards is even more than that. Now we're up to Braisa, but Braisa, you see, also the idea, it's Mishnah, but it's bar. It's the Mishnah as it's going outside of the world of Yetzirah, or as we'll learn soon where Braisa exactly is situated, but it's definitely bar. Mishnah is more internal, even though it's also relative to Atzilus. He also called it Shifcha, or called it Gashmis, compared to the Lakus of Torah and Atzilus. But you see the similar themes, but now it's through the lens of Torah. Before we learned about it from Tefillah, from the bottom up, like we discussed at length, for over the 550 pages that go back to volume 2, how we elevate the world from the bottom up, which is through davening. Tefillah primarily. Here we're talking how Torah is giving us a picture of godliness in this world, but it's also coming down. So the Torah also has both sides. Either way, it's an interface. Whether you go mamata lamata, it's still an interface. It's just two different ways, and both actually in a very eloquent way. Each one has something the other doesn't have. Torah gives us a clear picture of what's above. Tefillah is more internal because it's coming from our initiative and our needs, all the way down to what he called even before the Helam Ha'atzmi, that comes from the darkest place where a person doesn't feel completely lost and has hit rock bottom, as we discussed. That's from the bottom up. Torah gives us the picture of the divine from God's mind, like essentially giving us a snapshot of what God is thinking, but it's coming down into Mikra, and then into Mishnah, and then to Talmud, Braisa, and then into Talmud. So that's the context of what we're learning right now. So now I'm going to go back. Let's get back to the micro picture here. So on the bottom of page 1370, he began Omnam Braisa, which we learned is the level of Nehi. Mishnah is Chagas, because Mishnah is more Gilui. Nehi, as he's going to explain, is more operational, meaning it's much more, as he called it, Klei Hashpa, Lebar Megufa. It's outside of the body, as we discussed, like the kidneys or the legs, but it's outside of the body. He's going to go more detail later, next page. Chutz Matzmuse, and these are called Klei Hashpa. The instruments of transmission. In other words, we're not talking about the very transmission itself. That's chagas. When a person has love, that's the energy of attraction and love. I want to give you love. But how do I love? How do I transmit my love to you? That's nihi, the klei hashpa. And why? Because the mashpia on his own, because he's elevated and is in a higher level than the recipient, like someone, for example, that's a very big Baal Seichel. So he can't just teach and allow the flow of his chagas come to the student Well, here it's Chabad, it's a seichel, but the same idea as he's going to explain in a moment. He can't just let it come unfiltered, because the Talmud's mind is not ready for that, and he won't be able to receive it. That's why tzarich hamashpia lekatzer hashpa. He has to summarize it. He has to condense it. Lefi eifin klei makabel. I'm reading the last lines of page 1370. Oz yochel lekabel asasech. So that process is an additional process. So it's not just the teacher teaching ideas. That's the pure hashpah. But the klei hashpah, how? What are the channels, the funnels, the ways to communicate it? That's through nehi. And the same thing is with hashpah chesed. And we understand why the Rebbe Rashab is saying that, because we're talking about Mishnah's chagas. So even though this applies also to seichel, but it also hashpah chesed, nisha tev be'etzem, someone who's a fundamentally good person, the makabel who's not on that level, can't receive rav tev. You can't just receive the abundance of the goodness that you want to give. I mean, the language of the Gemara on this is rav tev ein yechel l'kabel. When Cheni HaMagel prayed for rain after there was a drought in Israel, so he prayed for rain, and the rain started coming down in buckets. It was flooding the fields. So he had to pray again, and he says, Rev Teva, too much good we can't absorb. The beauty of rain that be able to really benefit us is if it floods, it can destroy the field just as much as a drought can. Raindrops, so they can absorb the keli of the audits of land, has to take the drop by drop, like spoon feed it. So you see, chesed needs also klei hashpah to make sure that it's absorbed by the makabel. And this is the inyan of Netzach and Hod. So I'm going to read, even though we read it already, I'm going to start from the last line on page 1370, because now he's going to explain. Okay, so so we need klei hashpah, we need these channels, we need these instruments of transmission. In other words, it's just how do you pour the water? You need a funnel, you need a pitcher, you need a channel to irrigate the lower levels. So he says, this is v'zeh inyan. So the bottom last line on page 1370, the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. V'zeh inyan netzach v'hod. This is the role of Netzach and Hod. Even though he said nihi, but he's focusing primarily on Netzach and Hod. And we'll see if he mentions Yesod or not. Like I explained, in Ageres HaKedesh 15, he talks about all three. So I'll fill that in if necessary. But let's start with what he says. Netzach and Hod. What's Netzach? Netzach means, literally means victory, drive, determination, ambition sometimes. Netzach is Onof HaChesed. It's on the right side, so it's a branch of Chesed. Basically, Netzach is the tool, the instrument of transmission of Chesed. And what is its role? Hushatia hashpah. That Netzach is that causes that flow of the hashpah of Chesed. The truth also of Gvura, of all midas, but specifically Chesed. So he says now in the parentheses, and the following parentheses is going to explain even further the difference between Netzach and Hod in this process. But let's read it the way the Rebbe Rashab says it, and then we'll see how it gets explained. Now, keep in mind that the actual language Sheti Hashpah, before the parentheses, is actually the Tzemach Tzedek's words. And the parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab's addition to explaining what the Tzemach Tzedek said, the Maimah that I mentioned, that's called Lahavan Inya Mikra Mishnah Talmud from the Alter Rebbe, and the Tzemach Tzedek and the Tzemach Tzedek's version of it with his additions. So the Rebbe Rashab adds in the parentheses, Ukasher hi bebchinas Netzach, when Chesed comes into Netzach, it's not Chesed in its pure, pristine form. Because like we said, that goodness of Chesed is too powerful for the recipient to receive. So Netzach does something. It alters, I would say it channels is the right word, Chesed. So he says, the air of Chesed is not as strong in Netzach. What does that mean? because at times it's necessary la'akev u'lahaylim ba'atzmei ha'ava al derech moshel. To la'akev, to hold back, and lahaylim, and to conceal within yourself the love, for example. So a person has, let's say, great love to their beloved, a spouse, a child, but the recipient can't just receive your love unadulterated without the way it is within you. Like I said before, the rain comes down like a flood. You can end up suffocating and overwhelming the person you want to love. You see this. People can kill someone else with their love. I say kill, but I mean to say can overwhelm them. So part of love is also channeling it and making sure that it's given with the proper discretion and the proper channeling. That's what he's saying here. So at times, it's necessary la'akev, to refrain or hold back, u'lahaylim ba'atzmei, within yourself, the love you have. Ki kashatia ava b'tekev ha'izgalus, because when the ava would be b'tekev, with the intensity of revelation, revealed with full intensity, yeh memela chesed b'ribui. Remember, ava is an expression of chesed, of kindness, of love. So ava is chesed is the initial sphera, that's the attribute called chesed. So he says, then memela the chesed will be beribui. U'kamoy kain b'ashpos ha'seichel. He's going back to the example he gave before. Also, the same thing with when you're transmitting intelligence. Seichel kashayi ha'seichel b'teikav ha'izgalus ba'atzmei ti hashpa beribui. That when it would be the full intensity, the way it is within himself, then the hashpah would be also abundant, which would overwhelm and not be able to be received properly by the recipient. So the first thing you need to do, we're not talking now how you're communicating the love. Within yourself, you have this intense love to someone or this intense intelligence. Within yourself, you need to put on the brakes to make sure that your intensity is not being transmitted. As we'll soon see, Hod is the tzimtzum in the very hashpah, that when you're giving it to the student or to the recipient, you're giving it to them in bite-sized pieces. But the first step is more of a psychological one within you, that you need to refrain. You need to restrain yourself. That's what he's saying is Netzach. So that's that which you have within you, all that intense love, even though you may have the temptation to just hug and embrace someone you love, you need to hold back in order to, because it has to go be received by the individual that has to receive it. But rather it should be hashpah b'derech nitzachim. So let's explain what does that mean. B'derech nitzachim means, b'pashtus it means, b'derech nitzachim usually you'll say that you're doing it to be victorious. B'derech nitzachim means to be successful. But that doesn't really fit here to explain it that way. So b'derech nitzachim means that you're not doing it because the chesed is so abundant, but the chesed is being channeled, but derech nitzachim, that like you're, I don't want to say the word forcing yourself, but you're using the strength here is to both refrain from giving that much, and the way you're giving it is simply because the Netzach is pushing you to do so. I don't have the exact words to explain it. I think I sense that what it means, but he's basically saying that derech nitzachim, because derech nitzachim sometimes means you don't really want to do it, but you're doing it only to win, so to speak. Like sometimes a person will do it because there's a competition. They themselves wouldn't be so driven, but they feel because there's a resistance, that's why there's a derech nitzachim. That's usually how the expression is used. I'm just hesitating whether that's the way he means it here. No, but derech nitzachim means like when, like he says in Basel Ligani, for example, that the melech mevazbez, he splurges all his resources, all his treasures, because there's an enemy, and the enemy brings out from him that need to win. in a good way, a holy way to win. In other words, when there's a resistance, there's an enemy, your competitive juices begin to flow. That's usually what b'derech netzach means. But here, I can't see how that applies here, because the reason you're withholding is not because there's an enemy. There's not because the refraining is out of love. The love requires that you can't just give it all the way it is within you. So I don't think he means the idea that you're pushing against the restraint. So I'm thinking that it means more that, first of all, you need strength. You need netzach to restrain. That also needs power. Just like it says, Ezu Giber, Hakevish Yitzre. Who is the strong person? The one that conquers his Yetzer Hara. Strength doesn't always mean that you're flowing forward, that you're pushing something forward. It could also be you're applying strength to withhold. It takes a lot of effort and exertion for a person who has a lot of love to restrain that love, so the recipient can receive it. So that could mean b'derech netzach, that may be what he's saying, or b'derech netzach means that together with the refrain and the restraint also comes a certain push toward giving. I can't say for sure because he just says those two words, b'derech netzach. I'm happy if anybody wants to weigh in on this, but it has to also be contextualized. At the end of the day, what he's talking about here is that the Netzach is Ayin Beis gili kol kach. I'm just reading from the beginning of the parentheses. And that's behekel lepom la'akiv v'lahaylim ba'atzmei.
Maybe in practical Balabatisha terms, it just means to be effective, so that it's effective.
Maybe. It's possible. But the word netzachim would be effective. You could perhaps say that. As I said, there's so little here. He just says two words. So I would say that anything that helps explain the idea would work. Maybe I'll look around and see if this idea is explained elsewhere by the Rebbe Rashab or other places in Chassidus. But that applies as well. Yeah. But regardless, what we do see here is that Netzach adds something to Chesed that limits its flow. Not because you have less love, but because you need to limit it in order to be mashpiyat. That's Netzach. I think we may understand more when we read the next parentheses as well. And any questions? Any other questions?
Yitzchak said, in order to be effective, because Netzach means it's me'akev, but the purpose is not me'akev. The purpose is to bring these galus. You can't. So it has to be in an effective way.
Okay, so Yitzchak said that effective. Yeah, I said it. I agree. You could include that in the explanation. Yeah, no problem. I mean, the word netzachin usually means some additional element than just effective. That's why I said that it could be the netzachin to withhold. But the point is well taken. I am not disagreeing. Could be all the above. One second, I want to bring the Tanya. I want to see if Tanya in the Gersh HaKadosh adds anything. 1 second, please. Let's look at the Tanya. I actually just taught to explain this Tanya in one of the Kollel classes on the Midah of Netzach. Let's say Siman Tezvav. Let's see. Okay, so he brings first Isyatsus Kleis Yayitzes, which is the strategy how to transmit. And then on page Kuf Chav Beis, let's see. Yeah, that's Netzach V'Hed in general, Eitzah. Oh, here we go. He says, "V'gam b'chlal b'chinas Netzach u'lenatzeach u'lamed neged kol minei hashpah v'alimud mibnei mebayis u'mechutz." And I don't think it's the same thing. Here he says that Netzach is that when the mashpia has to sometimes resist anyone that's trying to be meneya the hashpah from
It's
within
not-
or from within.
No,
So
it's not.
That's a different pshat. No, I know. The bias and the yeah, here he says clearly, if the father, for example, has reason to feel to be judgmental of his child, and therefore he doesn't want it, he says his child isn't worthy of the ashpah, so he has to overcome. That's netzach, to overcome. So it's a different meaning here. The Rebbe Rashab is definitely not using this interpretation of netzach. Just pointing out, that's interesting that he's not going the way that it's not a contradiction, it's just a different aspect of netzach. Because remember, the Rebbe Rashab's goal here is to explain how Braisa is going to channel Mishnah to the next level. And here, the Rebbe in Tanya, that's not the pshat. Tanya is coming to explain how netzach in general is necessary for hashpah. So it's different objectives here. I'm just looking just to see. Hoid was say this discussions. Want to see one more thing because later he talks about it again on the next page. One minute, please. Okay, I'm not finding what I was looking for. I thought he explained it afterwards in the Nimshal. Okay.
What is kloyos yoyatsos? It means literally kloyos.
Yeah, that means that the advisory kidneys in Kabbalah. Remember the organs of the body, just like what means a lev, cheshik halev. The heart, physical heart has love in it. The heart has blood, but every part of the body also represents a certain midah. Meichin is easy because the mind has Chabad in it, Chochmah Bina Das. But where do you see Chagas in the heart? Nevertheless, because the heart is passionate and in the blood, Damu HaNefesh, etc., Chagas resides there. So the same thing in the Yeyet says is like you find it also Lahavdil in Christian, in Chinese, in acupuncture and so on. They talk about how each part of the body has, it's like an archetype for a particular feature. So the kloyos are compared to Netzach and Hod, kloyos Yetzis. So the kidneys exactly, are they actual Yetzim? I mean, the kidneys are cleansers. Physical kidneys don't give you advice exactly. But Beruchnis, it has some association with it. It filters. Kidneys are filters. And the Ruchnis, like it's say, Eish Ruach Mayim Ofer, they're archetypes more than actual physical. Like Eish is Yesod HaEish, is the personality of fire, not necessarily actual fire. See what I mean? Yeah. We're going to learn about, he's going to say this, I think Klei Yisrael says here too. I was just looking for Netzach. For some reason, I remembered more in Tanya. I can't find it now. Okay. So let's continue here. The next section, he says, now let's talk about Hod. So what's Hod's role? The Hod, he says, is anaf ha-gvura. It's a branch of gvura. So chesed netzach on the right, Hod gvura. Gvura Hod, rather. So Netzach is essentially the channel, or we call the instrument of transmitting chesed by limiting it, by refraining, by restraining. Here, ki ayidation is samtzim hashpa. So now he's using a new word, tzimtzum. Till now he used the word la'akev or la'hailin, to hold back, to restrain, to conceal. Now he's saying actually the hashpa itself is diminished, shezeu ma'onaf ha'gvura, which comes from the onaf, a branch of gvura. Hod is, in other words, is gvura in a lower state, a branch. Through that, the recipient receives the flow and the chesed. Nimtza. So what do we take from this? I understand. You'll ask, what's the difference between Netzach and Hod here? So the next parentheses, he's going to concern himself with that and address that. So just hold for a moment, restrain for a moment, and you'll see the answer in the parentheses. Nimtza. Lashpia tzorach gamken liyas b'chinas Hod. That to be mashpia, it's not just enough to have chesed. Netzach, but you also have to have Hod, which is a branch who onaf ha'gvura. Anaf ha'gvura, a branch of gvura. The Rebbe Rashab, now this is the Tzemach Tzedek's language. The Rebbe Rashab in this parenthesis, next parenthesis is going to explain what's the difference. But if you look at the words, you already can see the difference. One is that's restraining within yourself, your intense love. And the other is actually measuring what you're exactly going to give to the recipient. It's basically, one is like a helm within yourself, and the other is the helm that you apply to what words or what expressions of love you're going to pass on to the recipient. In the terms of seichel, the first is the teacher first has to somewhat limit his own brilliance, and then he has to apply a next thing, which would be Hod, would be what words and what expressions is he going to use to explain it to the student. But you need both, because if he doesn't have the first one, the second one won't work well. And vice versa. You need the second one as well, because it's not just enough to withhold it within yourself. You need to know, what are you going to express? You need to express something in a limited form. So here's going to be how he explains it. I just summed up what we're going to learn in the parentheses. And according to the above, you can say that here's the difference between Netzach and Hod. The Netzach hu hakovas hashpa ba'atzmei. Netzach is the restraint that you apply to the hashpa within yourself. V'hu b'moker hashpa. That's in the source. So, for example, let's say you have a wellspring that's bursting with a flow. We're not talking about a recipient yet, at all. Just the wellspring itself. In the moker hashpa, you have to do something to restrain that flow, or else no one will be able to drink from it. So b'moker hashpa, kamoy ba'er hasech, like for example, like er hasech, the brilliance of intelligence, or the light, then kasheru ba'atzmei, like when it's within himself, he needs to do something to not let his brilliance just to flow. Like, I don't know if you've ever spoken to one of these geniuses where they have no filters. They can talk and it's just like it's flowing like a wellspring, and nobody understands a word. They're just letting their brain, sometimes you say the guy's brain is just flowing and he's not allowing, there's no restraint at all. And the same thing, same thing with Ava. The Ava is so intense in Chesed, in the Moker HaChesed, in the root of Chesed, like the root of the wellspring. So what does Netzach have to do? Has to withhold, like he said, the same words in the top line of this page, in the parentheses, that it shouldn't be so intense, shouldn't be so revealed. That's Netzach. What is Hod? V'Hod what Simson v'Helen
What's the
ba'ashpa.
What's the problem with intense in Ahavo?
Same problem like with Seichel. If the intensity of it, the first thing you have to do is within yourself, you have to somewhat restrain the flow of your intensity. Or else, like I said before, it will flood or overwhelm. Let me just finish with Hod. I think it'll be understood clear. V'Hod, who at Simson v'Helen ba'ashpa, Hod is now not within the mashpia, within the source, where you're putting on restraints to the intensity within you. Hod is the tzimtzum in the ashpa itself. Now that you've already so-called, let's say the intensity was let's say rushing at 100 miles an hour, and you put the brakes on it, and it's now flowing at 20 miles an hour. Okay, the next step is you have to make sure now that the Mekabel receives it properly. So there's another thing that's necessary, that you have to measure what kind of student you're speaking to. You've achieved the first goal, you've achieved that the flow has become somewhat controlled. It's not as it is in its source. Now you have to actually measure how it's going to enter each Mekabel, and different Mekablim may require different forms of tzimtzum. So now it says, Hod is the tzimtzum elam ba'ashpa, mashakvar mashpia loy. We're talking about now what is already being mashpia to him, not within himself before there's the ashpa. Sheyeh b'bchinas tzimtzum, to make sure that this too is coming in a tzimtzum-dik way that's commensurate to the keli. So let me put it. I gave the example the other day with the barrel. Let's talk about a wellspring. A well is flowing from out of a stone. You sometimes see in a mountain, but it's gushing. It's like flooding. No way you're going to be able to capture any of that water and drink from it. Just too intense. So you put certain filters or whatever it is that you do to make the flow slower. Now, at least it's flowing in a way where now you can come and receive. Now, receiving itself is different. You could have a little child will just need a drop, and more than a drop won't work, won't be good either. Someone a little older can drink a little more. So the first thing you need to do is put controls to simply regulate the flow itself. Then you need to do for the Mekabel, for each Mekabel, you need to regulate it. Step number 2, that in the hashpah itself, it should go in a tzimtzum-dik way that the Mekabel can receive it properly. So he's explaining that's the difference between Netzach and Hod. Netzach is when you're within yourself, so to speak, within the source. And Hod is in the hashpah itself. That's what he's saying.
Can you take a question?
If you don't mind, let me finish the parentheses, because it may answer your question, may not, but it's definitely going to complete the picture. So let me just finish the parentheses. Actually, the rest of the parentheses is taken somewhat from the Tzemach Tzedek. I see. I marked it up here. Okay. Let me just see it for a moment. Yeah, the next section, the parentheses, explains this further. It's up to you. You want to ask a question now? Fine, I can go either way.
So this is about the transmission of Torah, apparently now at the level of Baraisa. But in any case, whether it's Mishnah, Baraisa, or even Talmud, so the Indian is like the halacha is the halacha, and you can't change Torah depending on who's receiving. Now, maybe you might say, well, in order for us lowly humans in Asiya to understand it, bichlal, you have to have these valves, if you will, and that's these different descending levels of detail, level of specificity. But in general, how can you say you're going to turn it on or turn it off more or less? Because the law is the law. It is what it is, and the details are what they are. So you can't change the details depending on whether the Makabel is smarter or more knowledgeable or capable of understanding or less capable of understanding. The details of the halacha are the details of the halacha.
So two things. First of all, this is far from finished. The Rebbe Rashab is going to come back to Mishnah, Brisa, Gemara, Talmud, and explain it in detail, and everything will be clear there. Let me just tell you that. That's number one. Number two, the way you have to think about it is not about details, but about elokus. Ava, the mashal of Ava or Seichel, beribui, in Chesed or Gvura, the way it is before there's Netzach and Hod, is how much of the divine is experienced in the Torah. So in Atzilus, like we learned earlier, or in higher levels, what dominates is the godliness within the Torah, not so much the details. With the Tzimtzumim we're talking about, Netzach and Hod, is how to package that godliness, that we can contain it and it shouldn't overwhelm us. That's how I would voice it. So the halachas don't change. It's just a question of whether you're seeing more the detail of the halacha. Like an example, make Kiddush and Shabbos. So that you understand. If you just heard it's the Hamshacha of Er Keser and Chachma, it may not be something we can tangibly relate to. So that's really the distinction. It's much more of a qualitative shift here than a quantitative one, as well as how tangible and concrete it becomes. But we're going to learn this more in detail. He's just beginning to develop the idea here.
Okay, thank you.
Because he's going to get back to why is Brisa more Nehi than Mishnah. That's what he's going to ultimately explain. Yeah, but that's what it's going to come down to. So now the next half of the parentheses is coming to further explain that he's using a little Kabbalistic language. So let me just introduce it before I read inside. Something we probably, I don't think we learned in Ayin Beis earlier, and maybe you may have not learned it altogether anywhere in Chassidus. It's not so common. So in Spheris itself, as we know, there are many levels. There's Chesed, there's the inner, we've talked about Pnimim, Emtsoyim, Chitzenim. So he's now going to introduce the idea of Nihi Pnimim and Nihi Chitzenim. That Nihi itself, there's an inner dimension of Netzach Hod Yesod, and there's an outer dimension. So he says now like this: V'im Kain, Kamoi Bechinas Nihi Pnimim v'Nihi Chitzenim. So we find in the difference between Nihi Pnimim and Nihi Chitzenim. This is, as I said, this is from the language of the Tzemach Tzedek. What do we see? The Nihi Pnimim hu inyan kloyes yeyitzes. What we mentioned before that brought in Tanya. So there's an expression in Chazal, kloyes yeyitzes. The kidney advisors. I think kloyes yeyitzes is also in is in Pasuk Eliyahu too. Does he mention something there? Treyarchin, he says, Treyarchin. Remember now. Anyway, Kloyes Yeyitzes refers to what call the advisor kidneys. Why? Because I'll just go over what I said earlier. The physical body is obviously very physical. You know, the heart, it pumps blood, contracts and expands. The mind, the brain, the mind is in the brain. Different parts of the bodies have different functions. But in Kabbalah, and also in Chazal in general, you find that different parts of the body associate with different functions. Now, when you think about advice, you don't think of it in terms of kidneys. Advice, what most people would say, comes from the mind. When someone comes to you for advice, or you are yourself consulting yourself, it seems to be an intellectual exercise. And yet, like I mentioned with the heart, you open up a heart, you're not going to find love. So why is love associated with the heart? I don't know if you ever thought about it. Even in the secular world, you know, you make a heart, it's a sign of love. I love you. Why? What's the heart have to do with love? And do you love more in your heart than you do, let's say, in your lungs? You love someone, you love someone. So you could say it just became a social symbolic thing. You know, heart, love, and so on. But the truth is, like I said, because the physical body is beyond being just a body, the organs also has quality features. You can call it symbolic features, archetypes. So just like the heart pumps blood, and blood is passion, fiery, so too are the emotions that way. Like in Tanya in chapter 9, he says, so just like the heart sends blood up to the mind, it also, the emotions, the impulses of them, the impulsive emotions also affect the mind, can affect the mind. So the heart's associated with passion, with fire, with fervor, which is essentially one of the symbolism, one of the features of love, passionate love. You love somebody, there's an attraction. So the kidneys, in a similar way, associate not with Ava and the Midas, it associates with Yeyitzes. Just like the kidneys filter the blood, and they filter, they eliminate toxins, eliminate waste. That's what they're excellent filters and necessary filters. So Chazal calls it Kleis Yeyitzes. Like a Yeyitz, what's an advisor do? Helps you filter through different information to be able to know what to do and how to do it. There in Tanya, the fifth Gesek 15, he actually explains it. I'll just read from there for a moment. He explains it by saying the following words. He says, like this. He says there's the hashpah itself, you're transmitting an idea or love, but then you need tzarich liyisayis eich lashpia. You need to consult or advise how to be mashpia. And he says that's the role. Ubchinas eitzazu nikras netzach v'heid shein kloyes yoyetzes. That's Netzach and Hod. So the kidneys represent Netzach and Hod. They're like the clays, just like the filters of the kidneys. They also filter to the ashpah. But then he says another thing. They sometimes also correspond to the two testicles. Trein bein hamavashlim hazera. That mavashlim literally means they cook the seed. So Rabbi Rasha, I'm just reading from Tanya because it's going to help us understand what he's going to say now in Ayin Beis. Shehi atipa nimsheches ma'amoyach. The tipa, the seed, the semen itself, the drop, originates in the mind, like he explained in chapter 2 in Tanya. Now, today we know it doesn't mean physically, but it definitely the mind and its concentration is necessary to produce seed. So what do the trained bay and the two testicles do? They filter it, that it shouldn't be just a very sublime seichel. So it's literally becoming a physical seed from something that is far more sublime and ethereal. That's what he says here. The train bain him gam yeah. So bottom line is that the kidneys and the testicles, which are both represent Netzach and Hod, they are more megashim. They make it more concretized, more what's another word, congealed, than they are in the more spiritual state. That's what he says here. He compares it to Atechem b'dichayim, like when you take a grain, when you take grain in the mill and you refine it, that you break it down into further crumbs, that's what it does. So it minimizes, it takes it away from its pure state and breaks it down into smaller states. That's what he says here.
I put the text in the chat box so people want to see where he's reading from.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the Rebbe Rashab is adding here, Umashin oison sheloi telech b'merutzo, right here.
I agree. I'm going to get back. Let me just finish one more thing and get us a cage, then I'll go right back. Yeah. He adds to it. It's correct. So he says, so the same thing is Kach Tzorech Ha'av. I'm reading from a Geras HaKedesh. The same as the father has to lahaktin aseichel, he has to diminish the seichel, v'dvar chochmeh, sheretzel ashpia libnoi, and the wisdom that he wants to transmit to his child, ulachalkom lechalokim rabim, and has to like break them down like into crumbs, v'leimele ma'at ma'at, and tell him spoon feed basically, tell him drop by drop, ma'at ma'at, says v'das. With Moyetzeis means yeyetz, with a certain wise counsel, v'das. That's what he says in the Geras HaKedesh. So now let's go back to Ayin Beis. So first he said Kleis Yeyetz. Says Oy kamoy train bein. So bein is in Aramaic beitzim. Hamavashtim esazera. That so-called cook, if you wish, the zera, umashin b'merutza, and they slow it down, that it shouldn't just flow quickly, should be controlled. That's what he adds. Exactly, your good point. In a Geras HaKedesh, he doesn't say that. Here he adds umashin b'merutza. There he just says that it takes it more from a more sublime place and becomes more megushim, more tangible, more concrete. But it's not a contradiction. Which is very similar to what he said before, that the flow from the source shouldn't just go uncontrollable. It shouldn't be so intense. It slows it down. That's Nehi Pnimim. The Nehi Chitzenim, then there's another role that Nehi plays. The outer dimension of Nehi, Hein hayarchin lekatzer hashpa. That's what he said earlier. All this is still within the mashpia. In other words, the kidneys and the testicles here are all within the mashpia to slow it down within himself. But then comes one more thing. You now have to transmit it. And that's Nehi Chitzenim. They're the yarchin lekatzer hashpa, that actually take the hashpa and either condense it or summarize it. Condense it would be the right word. So in other words, one is to slow down the flow, and the other is that it actually should come into drops and drops, or kahai gavna, etc., or other ways, that other aspects of how you diminish for the mashpia, for the makabel to receive. Basically, one is within the mashpia and one is within the hashpa to the makabel. That's the Nehi Pnimim and Nehi Chitzenim. That's what he just said. And what is that beruchnius? That's the example from the physical. In ruchnius kamay halimud b'derech tzara. Like when you teach someone in a very summarized way. Ukamay kitzer ha-mishneh kedem ha'arichas shebegemara. Like the brevity of the Mishnah before that arichas in the Gemara. I know you'll jump on this and say, didn't he just say this is Braisa? So be patient. We'll soon learn about that. So the Mishnah is far shorter. The Mishnah could be a few lines. The Gemara can be pages. So the kitzur of the Mishnah is saying is how the Mishnah is being condensed compared to the Gemara before you go into the arichas of the Gemara. Now, you have to qualify this because the Gemara arichas comes after the Mishnah. Here he's been talking about the opposite, how Nehi is diminishing the Chagas. So all this will be understood as we learn further. But right now, he's just using it as an example just to explain Kitzur, not so much the order, because what does the arichas mean? It seems like the other way around. Arichas should be higher than the Kitzur. Arichas is the way it's before it's Tzimtzum. So I don't think he means to say that literally in context of Mishnah and Gemara. He's just coming to explain that Mishnah is a Kitzur. That first you teach Mishnah to the student. And that's the second level of what's, so he's saying, this is nehi pnimim echitzenim u'kamoi kein yeshleim de kamoi kein. Similar to this distinction, you can say who b'chibeis madreg is the Netzach v'Hod, is the two levels of Netzach and Hod. Netzach is more like the nehi pnimim, which is restraint within the mashpia, in the source, and Hod is more like nehi chitzenim, the tzimtzum, the limitation, the condensing, as we transmit to the makabel. That's what this parenthesis came to explain. Very interesting.
It's interesting that this is the Talmud. The Lekatzer Ashpo is the Talmud.
Well, he's saying now is the Mishnah, actually. That's why I just said. I don't want to confuse it with what we're going to be learning. Because the Gemara is not, you'll see the Gemara is not the intensity of the higher level. The Gemara is a breakdown of the Mishnah. So you don't start. That's why ben chamesh lemikra, ben is eser lemishnah, ben chamesh eser legemara. Here the focus is more that Mishnah is short. You start first with kitzur, and then you come to Gemara barichas. Not to say that Gemara is higher. We'll soon learn this, but the point here is more that it's a kitzur, and you're not giving the full intensity. Not that the Gemara is the full intensity. That's not what he's saying here. He's coming to speak more that Mishnah is the kitzur before you get to the arichas of Gemara. But the arichas of Gemara is an expansion on the Mishnah, not the source of the Mishnah, obviously. As I said, we'll learn about it more. He's going to discuss it. But here the main focus is to understand how Netzach and Hod, essentially Nehi, is the filter, the regulator of the Klei Hashpa. You call it valve, gauge. I mean, all these words are correct. That are all the Klei Hashpa that are outside of Chesed and Gvura and necessary for the Hashpa to be transmitted properly. You still have to understand how that's Braisa and that goes outward. But we're getting the picture that Nehi is bringing the Hashpa outward, meaning to the next level, to the outer level, outside of the Mashpia. Any questions?
So here he spoke general Mishnah and Braise. He didn't specify because Nehi is the Braise.
I pointed that out because he's not finished yet. We're going to continue. He's going to explain. Right now, he just explained what Netzach and Hod are, basically. Just for the record, in Ageres HaKedesh, he explains Yesod as the iskashrus between Mashpia and Makabel, that you need them to have a bonding. I don't think he brings here Yesod. I'm looking quickly. I don't think he brings Yesod. I'm just adding why the Rebbe Rashab did not mention Yesod here. I'm not sure, because it's also part of the process. Maybe because it's not so relevant to Braisa, because it doesn't really add iskashrus. But Netzach and Hod is bringing down the Hashpa, Labar, Braisa, to outside. Maybe that's the reason. I'm not sure. Anyway, I'll continue to read. We're not finished. The subject is not over. He still has more to say. So now comes the next piece, where he says, now that we understand Netzach and Hod, he says, V'gam, Sorech Lahaylim es Hashpa. So in addition to what he said, that they have to limit the hashpa so the Makabel could receive it. He says you have to be also conceal the hashpa shetovi ba'efen achar b'kamei shehi etzle, that it should come in a different form. So in addition to, I guess he's saying, in addition to the condensing, it also has to be changed, shifted. So it's like almost, he doesn't say using an example, but it has to come into a new paradigm. Because the seichel, the way it is in the mashpia on its own, is on a different level. So you have to find another way of explaining it, the inyan achar, like you explain this seichel with a different seichel and say, this is how you understand this one. What he probably means is that the inyan should fundamentally be commensurate to the recipient. Because the inyan be'etzem is usually refers to the inyan before it's been condensed or before it's been transformed. But here you have to say, Hainu Shabbat Seichel be'inyan acher. Unless you say there's missing a word here, and it should say Sha'inyan be'etzem uloi be'erech hamakabel. But I don't think we want to just correct if it's not necessary. But if you really think about it, we usually say inyan be'etzem. Why does it have to be changed into another seichel? Because the inyan be'etzem may not be lefi erech hamakabel. I don't want to go on the limb and say that. So I'd rather force it and say that the inyan be'etzem should be be'erech hamakabel. So to do that, you have to bring another idea to explain that first idea. It doesn't have to be necessarily an example, but it's a seichel acher that the recipient can relate to. So we bring the idea that would have been more abstract on its own in the teacher. Now, what is he adding here? It sounds like he's adding an additional component that it's not just summarizing, like condensing it, like we talked about Kleis Yetzes. Or what did he say before? Here he's actually saying that you have to actually shift it and change it. But that's similar. No, it's not similar. So you have to actually change it. In other words, so you have to have within the mashpia the shift where he limits the flow, he restrains. It moves from more ruchnius to a little more gashmius. Then you need the kitzur in the hashpa.
Maybe the verbiage changes so that it can fit the makabel better. The makabel can understand it better. So the verbiage changes. It gets, I don't know.
Yeah, I know. So the second level is concealing and diminishing. And the third, what he just said now, is also needed is to conceal it in a way that it manifests. It could be verbiage, or it could also be in the paradigm. You're talking now in a different paradigm. You're talking a language that the recipient can relate to. It would be like explaining an idea, like let's say, fire in its source is gvura. But gvura can be something too sublime that we don't fully understand. It's a spiritual entity. Then you say fire is hot, is intense. So it's more of in a different idiom or different paradigm, the same idea, but it's coming now in the language that is be'erech hamakabel. Now the interesting, just for the record, he's going to explain another parenthesis to explain this. So I think this will be helpful. So here's the next parenthesis. This one they note below that the parenthesis doesn't end, so they suggest it ends after the words Ela Makabel. So it's 4 lines, and I would agree. The parentheses should end. It's a 4-line parenthesis. I'm going to read it now. Ukamoi. Okay, it gives a good example. Yeah, the example will be helpful here. Ukamoi primis atera. Like the difference between primis atera, she oisa inyan mamish bedin hanigla. So when you talk about primis atera, let's say the primis atera of Shnaim Eichzim Betalis. So we know there's the famous Torah. So in the beginning of Bab Metzia, it says Shnaim Eichzim Betalis. Two people are holding on to a talis. And this one says, Zeh kuli shali, Zeh emer kuli shali, Zeh emer kuli shali. Each one says, it's mine. They found the talis, and each one's, and both of them are holding on to it equally. It's not like one has it all under his control, the other one's claiming ownership. They both are holding on to it, and each one says it's mine. So the halacha is yechleiku. You sell it, each one can get, you don't cut it in half because that doesn't, but bottom line is you divide it because each one has a claim. That's the halacha. So Chassidus, it brings a Torah that's talking about two people who had an effect on a neshama in this world. Two people influenced, inspired somebody. And when they come to the next world, they both say, I get credit for him. Because I'm the one that inspired him or taught him and so on. So it says, they each get schar, they each get reward. So the pnimius hatera of it, or the similar is with other things. Klayim, for example, the isra of klayim, you can't mix wool and linen. Or the same thing, klay hasodet, certain things can be mixed, can be grafted. So that's in Gashmis. But what's wool and linen? Why can't they be mixed together? So it says it's because like chesed and gvura, like milk and meat. Two different worlds. And you don't want to be mavalbul and destroy the boundaries that God created. So what he's saying is that pnimius hatera, she'esa inyan mamish shebedin hanigla. It's exactly the same inyan, but it's in a different paradigm. But the way it's in pnimius hatera, we may not be able to relate to it because it's too spiritual. But when you speak about it in a physical halacha, this is an expression of how the wisdom manifests commensurate to the recipient, because everybody could understand linen and wool, and they may not understand chesed and gvura. I'm just giving an example. There are more sublime examples than that. Someone say tzimtzum harishin. We know is a very deep concept. For many people, they can't fully understand, but you tell them, when was the last time you were in distress? When was the last time you did not feel godliness? You did not feel inspired? They'll say, oh, that I relate to. That's not mamish halacha, but I'm just giving you an example that when you bring it into a physical manifestation in your life, you can relate to it. In the tzimtzum itself, it's a sublime, abstract concept that can be completely non-relatable. So it's the same idea, except one is in a manifest, concrete, tangible, palpable expression of it, and one is sublime. U'kamoy kain, b'seichel shemevi ha'mashpia la'seichel, es ha'seichel. And the same thing is with seichel, that the teacher, the mashpia, he draws the seichel be'in kazeshu be'erech ha'makabel. So he gave the example pnimius hatera nigla, but there's also when a mashpia takes an idea and he explains it in an idea, in something, in a concept that is commensurate, that relates to the recipient. V'gam b'mishalim v'esbeidim, and also with examples and explanations, in a way that should be comprehensible and understandable to the recipient. So all that is to explain what he said outside before the parentheses, and here's where the parentheses ends, that he has to be ma'alim the seichel, not just condense it, but actually change its paradigm, change its language, but more than language here. It's also change the idiom, the world, and the paradigm in which it's addressing, to make it understandable to the student, to the recipient. So now, after the parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab concludes. I'm going to stop here, but I'll just share where he's going to go because I have to run now to something. He's going to now explain this is what the braises are. That the braisa is not just that it wasn't said in the Beis Medrash. The braisa is actually things that are hinted to a beremes. The braisa expresses in a language that we can relate to more. But I want to do this tomorrow more at length and more properly. So I'm going to stop here at the end of the parentheses, and we now need to go back to explain how braisa is this level of nehi that he's been discussing how it brings down the Mishnah into another paradigm, so to speak. Okay. I'm going to stop here because as I said, I have some deadline I have to do. If you don't mind, I'll take more questions if there are tomorrow. So I'm going to stop here at the end of the line.